Thanks for listening to the Media People Podcast, lively and insightful chats with the people who power the media industry. I'm your host, Victor Genova. For more episodes, go to soundcloud.com/mediapeoplepodcast or subscribe on iTunes by searching Media People Podcast. Views expressed by participants are personal. Editorial content is only one of the facets a magazine's editor-in-chief is charged with overseeing. They also act as the public face of the brand, handle publicity, and represent at industry events, among other things. These are the many hats today's guest, Michelle Kelly, wears. Michelle is the editor-in-chief of Cottage Life magazine. And what makes Michelle's climb to editor-in-chief so interesting is that unlike many of the past guests on this podcast, who have moved to different companies to gain experience and grow professionally, Michelle's career has exclusively been at Cottage Life. Starting out as the receptionist, Michelle Kelly tells us about her rise from the front desk to the corner office.
So Cottage Life was started in 1988, and it began as a magazine, and the idea was that it was a bit of a handbook for cottagers, people who had purchased a cottage and didn't know how to build a set of stairs or take care of the septic system. So we began a magazine which focused on service to teach them how to do all of the things they needed to know to maintain their properties, but also to let them have a bit of an escape. So they got Cottage Life in April when there was still snow on the ground, and it let them think about, beautiful summer days when they were at their favorite place on earth at the cottage. And it took off really quickly. It was really a fantastic idea. It was a great niche group of readers that we were able to capture the advertising community's attention with, and also create some really great content that was really appreciated, that the readers really needed. And it wasn't long before Al Zikovitz, who founded the magazine, saw other opportunities to take his brand sort of across platform, which at the time was a very smart thing for him to do. This was, pre-Martha Stewart even. And he started a consumer show. So a 3-day event where cottagers from all over Ontario would come and they would shop for docks and boats and lawn furniture. And that was a huge success. And so we looked for other ways to expand his empire as it became. And now we have not just that consumer show, but we have a television network, a very robust website and social media channels. We have a line of licensed merchandise, and we're always looking for the next big opportunity. So really, Cottage Life is now the one-stop shop for all things cottage in Canada and even beyond.
Before we go any further, I want to go back to the beginning. Where are you from?
I am born and raised in Toronto.
Local person.
I'm a local.
What was life like growing up in Toronto? Like, what part of Toronto were you from?
So I am from North Toronto. I had a fairly idyllic upbringing. I come from a pretty big family. I have 3 brothers, and we were all very lucky. We had we kind of living in North Toronto. It's a little bit of a suburb in the city. We had lots of strong community, lots of, playing in the street until the lights came on kind of upbringing. And we were all very involved in sports. And of course we had our cottage that we went to every weekend.
So the cottage was already a big part of your diet growing up then?
Oh yeah. Yeah. My cottage, my family cottage was actually built on land that my father's father had owned, that he very smartly bought way back when it was, super cheap to buy waterfront property in Eastern Ontario. And he bought, a huge swath of a lake on the Rideau, and basically my dad bought that land from him and built a cottage on it before my parents were even married. And in fact, my mother is from the town where that cottage was built. She grew up in that small town. So my dad was from Toronto. So that was I think of that cottage as being my second home. So cottaging is truly in my blood and has been my whole life. And I spent every summer there growing up.
And growing up, you were a bit of an academic, but also quite the athlete as well. Let's touch on that first.
That is generous.
But you were a pretty big figure skater.
Yes.
Talk to us about that, because I find figure skating interesting because, as we were chatting about beforehand, it's a pretty difficult sport. There really aren't any training wheels for you. You jump for the first time and you don't land properly, you're going to fall. Yeah,
well, luckily you don't start out by jumping, right? But I loved figure skating. We grew up really close to a rink, in fact, right across the street practically. So when I think sometimes I was skating out of necessity, I had 3 siblings. We were all pretty close in age. And I think for my parents, they were running in all different directions, trying to ferry us from one event to hockey to piano lessons to this to that. And it just so happened there was this rink nearby. And so I loved skating from the second I did it. I think I was 5 when I started. And it was really the thing that I did, every day after school until I was pretty well into my teens. And then at that point, I grew to be about 5'8", and not a lot of opportunity for tall girls in skating. Yeah,
it's sort of capped then.
Oh, yeah,
kind of
definitely.
Like a jockey or a race car driver, where
I should have been a jockey. That's actually a great idea. No, you know what? I wish I had been a hockey player because but at that time, this was in the 80s. There wasn't a lot of girls hockey. It wasn't certainly not as popular as it is today. But luckily for me, I found an outlet in skating, which was through what's now called synchronized skating, but back then was called precision skating, and it's a team event. So there's anywhere from 20 to 30 people on the ice at once skating together. And that ended up being something that I really got into and was able to spend a lot of time on the team and going all over Canada for competitions. And it was just such a healthy environment for me. It was, and in fact, pretty great to be on a team sport as a female, because again, that wasn't as common to have soccer teams or hockey teams when I was that age. So I was really lucky to have that outlet.
So when you say it was a team sport, how many of you were on the ice at once, or did you train as a team and then you did your own individual competition, your own individual
No, we trained as a team. So there was 32 of us on the ice at once. And this was back in the day. It's no longer like this. Now synchro is, in fact, what they do now is completely different. It's very much they're vying for a spot in the Olympics. They want to bring the sport to the Olympics. And it's really something that they're professional athletes. Was
this more ice capades, you could say?
Maybe a little bit ice capades. Yeah.
If anyone listening remembers ice capades.
Yeah, no, that's right. But it is sort of the kind of, a group all doing formations on the ice and doing the same movements at the same time. And again, back then it was way different than what it is now. Right now it's really quite, they're really elite athletes that are doing it. For me, I was, I was very committed to doing it 3 or 4 times a week, but by no stretch was I an elite athlete.
You also mentioned that you've got a great love of reading and the arts. Favorite author, book, anything that influenced you?
Oh, wow. That's a really difficult question. It's funny. As I was growing up, I wasn't huge into reading. Actually, I never really read. I was the kind of kid who needed to move. I was never the kind of kid who could sit still. So that's why sports were such a great outlet for me. Yeah, exactly. As I got older and developed a better attention span, I came to really love reading and books. And now, of course, I'm a professional editor and writer. So I think as that became my job, reading became even more important because it is so inspirational and instructive for me in my work. My favorite author, honestly, I could tell you, I don't know that I have a favorite author, but I have books that I could read again and again. Let's say, what's a good book?
Those are pretty rare. I do a lot of reading myself, but actually finding that one book you could pour over and over again, I think that's pretty rare.
Yeah, no, for sure. I have to say, if I was to choose an author, I love Alice Munro. I love the way she writes is so clear and beautiful, and the way she structures her stories are incredible. And she's a true treasure. So she is definitely one of my favorites, and I could read her stories over and over again. But listen, I will read pretty much anything you put in front of me. I'm not, I'm happy to read something that's a cheesy romance novel is to me just as fun as reading something that's really in-depth history about the Second World War. All of it can be interesting to me. I have pretty eclectic taste in that way.
Who's Penny Caldwell? Because you cite her as being one of your influences.
Yes, Penny Caldwell. Well, Penny Caldwell is a career maker, I think is what I was saying about her. And for me, that's absolutely true. For 15 years, she was the editor of Cottage Life magazine. She was the editor just before me. And she hired me into the editorial department and was really, truly not just my mentor, but my boss for many years. And one of those people who seemed to have limitless abilities to foster the talent around her. She had time to teach you things, to show you things, even when you knew she actually didn't really have time. Not to mention, as the editor of the magazine, she truly set a standard for us here that is, the highest standard. We learned, all the people on the editorial team learned so much from her, and she made the magazine the respected publication. It was always respected, but she sort of really solidified Cottage Life as being one of the best magazines, I believe, in the country. And that really is all because of her.
What about Al Zikovitz? You mentioned him as well.
Yeah. So Al started the magazine in 1988 and really had this visionary plan for what cottage life would be. He's still involved, particularly with the consumer shows at the magazines, and is one of those people. And, I talk about Penny being such a strong mentor and helping people around her get better at what they're doing. And a lot of that was enabled by Al, because he was very much, as the CEO and the president of Cottage Life Media, even as we were seeing all this success, he always had time to answer your questions. I remember I actually joined the magazine as the receptionist, and here I was, the receptionist, 22 years old, just out of university, very green, not knowing anything. And he would stop whatever he was doing to stand at my desk and explain anything I wanted. No question was too big or small. And I think that attitude that he had and that Penny had really permeated the entire organization. And, I think to watch Al is to learn about not just how to start, an entrepreneurial business, but to understand how to create a work culture that has people giving you their best every day. And really having fun and creating a great culture. He's truly a master of that.
But Cottage Life wasn't your first job. You started first as a camp counselor in high school. Tell us about your first gig ever.
Yes, I guess that's true. So I went to a camp called Camp Oconto, which is in Eastern Ontario, and it was close to my cottage, which is how I ended up there, an all-girls camp. And I can say, so started going when I was 11, and then I became a counselor, and that was, my first summer job was being a counselor to kids. And it's funny, I say I'm a huge believer in going to camp, not necessarily that one, although it's a fantastic place, but any camp, because you learn such incredible leadership skills, such incredible self-confidence. Just, you know how to paddle a kayak and tie all of the knots and learn how to start a fire and all of those camp things, but you also learn how to believe in yourself and how to lead others. And, I still say to this day that the majority of my leadership skills that I use all the time in my current role, I learned at Camp Oconto when I was 17 years old.
A lot of independence comes with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I look back, for a couple of summers was a tripper. So I think the summer I was 18, I would take campers out on canoe trips. And this was back in the day. There was no cell phones. There was no GPS. You took, 6 or 7, 9-year-olds in a canoe and you went into the wilderness for 3 days. And I look back at that and I think, wow, I was a child doing that, but wow, what a responsibility that you have. And you recognize that it's a big responsibility. And then when you meet it, it's hugely confidence building, and you do learn a lot of independence, and that can sort of feed you at such a formative time. And it really does help you throughout your whole life. And you call back on those skills, and it really teaches you what you're capable of. So camp is, to me, the number one thing to do with your kids.
It's funny you mentioned that anecdote right there, that story, because I don't think that would fly now. I think all the kids would have to be tagged with cell phones so they know their exact location. Hell, it might not even happen because the lawyers would get involved and say, no insurance would cover this. Well,
I know insurance is definitely a big part of their expenses at camp, but it's funny, I just recently learned that they're not allowed to be on social media at camp. And in fact, the camp itself doesn't even post on their Instagram page of during the session, because part of what they offer is sort of a digital detox for these kids, because I think teenagers now are all so into social media and their cell phones. So it's actually a nice break from that at camp.
You know what? I missed social media through high school. It wasn't part of my diet either. And I'm glad I did.
Thank
I can't
goodness.
imagine what kind of pressure that would have put on a kid.
I'm glad there are no photos of
like
many
this
of the
photo.
things.
You can't sit with us at lunch or talk or whatever. Yeah.
No, it's such pressure for sure.
Where did you go to university?
So I went to Queen's University in Kingston.
And what did you study during your time at Queen's?
My major is in history. I studied mainly 20th century American history, but had a focus on women's history and women's studies.
100 years from now, if you could go back and study 21st century American history, it'd be one hell of a textbook, wouldn't it?
I feel like 2017 on its own would be quite something, particularly for someone who's studying women's studies, but yeah.
So as a lead into becoming editor-in-chief and starting at Cottage Life, you got into, in the essence, what is storytelling at its most basic form at university, or its most original form.
100%. It's actually such a good point. Taking a history degree, of course, at the time that I was taking it, I didn't really understand how it might inform my work later on, but it was really about understanding how what we study and who is studying history that makes such a difference to how we interpret the past. And that was really, sort of at the time when I was taking my degree, it wasn't just learning, in 1945, World War II ended, or, in 1969 was the summer of love or any of that. It was really more about, okay, who is telling these stories and what perspective are they telling it from? And how is it that moving forward, we're neglecting other perspectives, and how can we round out our understanding of what's happened in the past so we can better understand what's happening in the present and then in the future.
Perspective's a big thing, because as editor-in-chief, you have to bring your own voice to the magazine. You kind of become the voice of the magazine.
I'm really conscious of that, for sure. We have a really strong editorial team, among them some fantastically talented writers, and we try to maintain a consistent tone across the magazine that, I don't like to get in the way of that, because really my job is to sort of take, have a guiding tone of it's fun and lighthearted, but, we never want to be prescriptive in the way that we tell people to enjoy their cottage.
What about outside of the classroom? Anything extracurricular there that you learned or you can take away from your time at Queen's or in Kingston?
I was really good at partying in university.
That's
I
not a bad
spent a lot of time at the bar.
So you came away with memories.
Oh, I came away with memories. All right. No, I had fun for sure. I think, my first 2 years, I often look back with regret, actually, because I could have spent more time studying. You look and you think I could have spent all of that time and money learning a new language, or, really you can learn anything that you want. And in that, I don't think I really understood or grasped how lucky I was to be in that position. And it wasn't until third year where I really sort of started to focus on my academics more and got so much out of it. But, I was very social. I met a lot of people, some of my best friends today, so I can't regret that. And I think also, we lived in a house, and, you together with some of my classmates. And of course, that teaches you how to be a good friend. And, all of that was good. I had a part-time job, and near the end, I was also skating again. So, you learn time management skills, which are so crucial in today for me and for most of us. So, life skills as well as scholastic skills.
You've already mentioned that your first gig out of university was with Cottage Life magazine. How did you find yourself in that first role? And one more time, what was it again?
I have a very unorthodox story, actually. So my mother had a friend who worked at Cottage Life as a salesperson. She was selling the magazine ad pages. And she had casually mentioned to my mother that they were looking for they were looking for a receptionist. And I had just come back from Queens, and I was living with my mom here in Toronto, and I really wanted to go backpacking. That was pretty much my only goal at that point, with kind of this weird idea in the back of my head that I would go into journalism. And so I just followed up, and I called to get this receptionist job, and went in and was lucky, got the job, and thought, okay, I'll stay here for 6 months, and then I'm going to take off and go backpacking. And I ended up staying. I had so much fun, and I was, making a paycheck for the first time, and living in the city, and kind of had no care in the world, frankly, and ended up staying for 15 months before I eventually did quit my job and went backpacking in New Zealand and Southeast Asia, and this big 6-month trip, which was fantastic.
What did you learn about yourself when you did that? Because a lot of people I speak to are like, oh, I regret that. I should have done that. And I kind of give them the speech where it's like, well, if you don't have kids and you don't have a mortgage, take 3 to 6 months to do that.
Oh, for sure. For me, I think it's a different experience for everyone, right? I was a pretty sheltered kid. I didn't even have a passport, in fact, before I did that trip, and I was 23 years old. So for me, it was so eye-opening. I went by myself. So I spent all this time traveling in, figuring out how to get myself around and keep myself safe. And again, this was like pre-cell phones, even really, like there wasn't even a lot of email at this point. Certainly we weren't walking around with email in our pockets the way that we do now. So yeah, I really learned I learned how to make my way, and that was pretty awesome. And again, I definitely call on that confidence all the time.
So you do the backpacking, you come back, and you return to Cottage Life magazine. Yeah,
so I came back flat broke, and I basically went into the office to say, hey, do you have any office work that I can do? They knew me, I knew them, and thought, there might be an opportunity here just to make a couple of $100. And I think they did hire me to do something office some office work around that time. But when that was happening, they had a new position open in the editorial department, which was editorial assistant. And I had at this point pretty much decided that I would apply to journalism school and had started that process. And Penny Caldwell, who had just become the editor of the magazine at that time, encouraged me. She and Faith Cochran, who was the art director at the time, encouraged me to apply for this role. And I did. And I was competing against people who had already had their journalism degree. And it was a really prized, it was a great job to get for sure in magazines. And I was lucky because they knew me and they knew how connected I was to the culture of cottaging and how passionate I was. They knew that they could work with me, and that gave me a lot of advantages. So I ended up being offered the job and took it and decided not to go to journalism school, decided instead to learn on the job essentially. And that was a really great decision because here I am all these years later, 17 years later.
Where did you apply to journalism school?
I think I applied to, I didn't end up applying because I had already started preparing. Okay. Maybe I did. Oh, honestly, Victor, I can't remember. I think I applied to Carleton and Western and Ryerson, I want to say.
Were you struggling with that a lot, whether or not to go back to school?
Well, not really, because I had no money. I had done all of my undergrad on loans, student loans. So I had a huge debt, a huge student loan debt. So I wasn't that keen on taking on more, which is what I would have had to do. And, I talked to other people I guess I talked to other people who were either just in journalism school or coming out of journalism school, or even journalists themselves who'd say to me, you don't really have to go to journalism school. I mean, it's great if you can, but if you don't, you've got a job. Worst case scenario, you after 2 years of doing this job, you can go back to journalism school, make a little bit of money, and then go to journalism school, and you'll have a easy time getting in because you'll have had this experience.
So really, economics played a part with that. Sure.
Oh yeah, sure. Every decision, economics plays a part for me, but yeah, absolutely, economics was a big part of it.
Let's fast forward a little bit. I want to ask you about the role you had before you became editor-in-chief. What were you doing at that point?
Well, I had a lot of roles. It wasn't like I was receptionist, editorial assistant, editor-in-chief. I had essentially worked my way up to, I think I have a stack of my old business cards, and they're all, it's so funny because they're all Cottage Life, but editorial assistant, assistant editor, associate editor, senior associate editor, managing editor, senior editor, managing editor, executive editor. So, I mean, this was 15 years of different roles, but essentially I was learning the ropes for all of that time, learning how to, at first, just the the basics of journalism, like fact checking and assigning stories and research. And then, as I went, I would start handling more stories, working with the art team more, understanding layout, how a layout works. And then beyond that, really working more closely with Penny to think about on a big picture level, how does the magazine present itself to the readers? What's the tone? How are the themes working? And then beyond that, working with the sales team has become a huge part of what I do in thinking about how we can serve the advertising community as well as the readers. And, that's an ever-changing field right now for us in magazines. So all of that sort of led to, and then, of course, thinking about the business side of things, which, for so long I was focused on just the creative side. And now I'm thinking more about, okay, what new opportunities can we find while, still, of course, the foundation always providing good material for our readers and entertaining them and informing them, surprising them, delighting them, all of that stuff together.
And looking back at your entire career with Cottage Life magazine, I mean, how did you make the jump from role to role? This is something a lot of people are curious about because you're never really sure whether or not if you're being too tenacious or being too ambitious. When an opening happened above you, did you go into your boss's office and be like, I want to be considered for it? Maybe some days you're sitting at your desk and they're like, Michelle, you're up.
It confuses me so much why, if you want something, you have to ask for it. You have to say, hey, no one's going to see you as something unless you present yourself that way. So, for example, this happened to me several times where there was a position opening above me and I would go to Penny and say, hey, I want that job. What do I need to do to get it? And at least once I didn't get it, which I remember was very upsetting, but and then I tried again the next time. And even though the first time not getting it, I think one of the editors senior to me had left and I wanted his job and I didn't get it. And I remember thinking, well, at least now they know I want it, because the truth is they don't always know you want it unless you say. And I mean, I think this is a particular problem for women, of course, where they don't put their hand up and say, I want to be considered. I think that, you know, at least women in my generation are often taught to be more, you know, more relaxed about their ambition or embarrassed about it, not to be aggressive, all of those qualities. And I think it's a shame, because I think unless you're ambitious, there's no shame in being ambitious. It's a great thing to do. It will propel you forward. Yeah, it can get you into troubles, perhaps, if you're a little bit too ambitious and too outspoken. But to me, the opposite of that is a far worse problem to have.
I completely agree. The best bit of advice I ever received was, if you don't ask the question, then the answer is always going to be no.
100%. And another question I ask myself all the time is, well, what do you have to lose by doing X? Well, you know what? Oftentimes, and I know this now as a manager, when someone who is on my team comes to me and wants something or wants to be considered for something, they, you know, even if I tell them no, in my head, I think good for that person, because they're showing me confidence, they're showing me initiative. And those are an amazing qualities to have as an employee or as a team member. So to me, there's very little to be lost by being ambitious. There's way more to be lost by not being ambitious.
If you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self?
It's a good question. For me, a really defining moment in my career came when I realized, I think it was probably, you know, I was maybe 3 or 4 years into it, and I was still doing what would be considered junior level work, a lot of admin stuff, but starting to get into some meatier jobs. And I think I was, you know, this is back in the day again, where photocopying was a big thing. It doesn't happen as much anymore, but because we all have laptops and we're carrying around all of our work with us, you know, in our little computers. And back then it wasn't like that. You go to a meeting with lots of paper, you know, paper. I remember having a moment being like, you know, if this is what I'm going to do, and this is going to get me on the road to doing something that I, you know, to being a handling editor on a feature story, and I have to do this to get to there, then I'm going to be the very best photocopier there is ever. And realizing that taking pride in what you're doing and doing whatever it is you're doing the best you can, there's nothing to be lost in that. You're learning work ethic. You're showing people that you take pride in your work and what you're taking your job seriously. And I wish that I had learned that earlier, because I think once I did, it motivates you, because no matter what's going on around you, as long as you're putting in, you know, your best effort, people do actually notice that. I am a firm believer that people notice that. So I wish I had come to that conclusion a little bit earlier. And I think also, you know, I wish that I had maybe not taken it so seriously for a long time. I say often now when we're making the magazine, you know, we're making a magazine about going to the cottage. If we're not having fun doing it, we're doing it wrong. And that's true. I mean, we can't take ourselves so seriously. And, you know, we do talk about issues in the magazine that are to be taken seriously, but on the whole, that's not really, you know, there's a lot of fun stuff regardless. So I wish that I had enjoyed that ride a little bit and not been so anxious for the next step. But again, I think I did okay.
If you weren't media, what do you think you'd be doing, and why?
Wow. Well, as I already talked about, figure skating is a huge passion of mine. So I feel like I'd love to be, you know, an Olympic figure skater, which is definitely never going to happen. But yeah, anything in sport. I mean, I love sports. I follow almost every sport closely, most sports closely. And, you know, I love it. And I think probably I would be involved in sport on some level, if not doing it, likely not doing it, maybe covering it, or even just facilitating it for people, because I really think sports and physical fitness is such a huge thing that can make people happy in their lives. And I think that everyone should have access to it, an opportunity to not just watch it, but to do it, because I think it really can help build so many skills and just let people have fun. So yeah, I think something in sports.
Michelle, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Victor.
That's it for today's show. But for more episodes, you can go to soundcloud.com/mediapeoplepodcast or subscribe on iTunes by searching Media People Podcast. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @VicGenova.